When I handed my landlady the rent, she leaned closer, her voice trembling just enough to make my heart stop. Rent isn't the only thing I want. When I first moved into the apartment, I thought of it as nothing more than a practical choice. Affordable rent, a quiet street, and the kind of building that carried a little history in its walls. It wasn't perfect. The steps creaked. The paint had faded in places, but something about it felt lived in, as though the place had seen its share of laughter, arguments, and soft moments of silence. And then there was her, my landlady. The first time she opened the door for me, I noticed her presence more than her appearance. She carried herself with an easy confidence, the kind that only comes with age and experience, though there was a gentleness underneath it. Her hair, dark with a few strands of silver, framed her face in a way that was both graceful and disarming. She smiled politely as she showed me the space, her voice calm and steady, but her eyes, they held something unspoken. Weeks passed. Life settled into a rhythm, work during the day, the quiet hum of the apartment at night. I paid the rent on time, exchanged small pleasantries when I saw her in the hallway, and thought nothing more of it. Until one particular evening. The air that night was warm, the kind that carried the faint scent of rain even though the sky was clear. I knocked on her door, the envelope of rent money in hand. She answered with that same calm smile, but there was a softness in her eyes that caught me off guard. "Come in for a moment," she said. Her tone was casual, but the invitation carried a weight I couldn't quite define. Inside, her home was neat yet personal. Shelves lined with books, a faint trace of lavender in the air, the dim lighting wrapping everything in a cozy warmth. I handed her the envelope, expecting the usual polite exchange, but instead, she hesitated. Her fingers brushed mine as she took it, a small, deliberate pause that made me notice the warmth of her skin. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She studied me as though searching for something in my expression. And then she leaned slightly closer, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Rent isn't the only thing I want." The words were soft, but they carried a charge that rooted me in place. My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure if she was teasing me, testing me, or bearing something fragile she rarely allowed herself to say aloud. Her breath was warm against my ear, and though she pulled back a moment later, the silence between us thickened, heavy with possibility. I forced a smile, but inside, my thoughts raced. Did she mean it literally, figuratively, emotionally? I didn't know. All I knew was the way her gaze lingered a heartbeat too long, the way her hand remained on the envelope as though reluctant to let go, and the sudden awareness of how close we were standing in her softly lit living room. That night, as I returned to my apartment, her words echoed in my mind. Rent isn't the only thing I want. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something I wasn't ready to name, but couldn't ignore. After that evening, I tried to convince myself I had misheard her. Or maybe she'd meant something simple, something practical. But no matter how many times I replayed it in my head, her whisper carried a tone that felt deliberate, like a door she'd left half open, waiting to see if I would step through. And yet, the days that followed didn't bring clarity. Instead, they brought silence. She didn't mention her words again, and I didn't dare ask. But something between us had shifted. The air seemed different each time we crossed paths, charged, as though even the smallest gestures carried unspoken meaning. I began to notice her more in the in-between spaces of daily life. The way her laughter filled the hallway when she spoke to a neighbor. The faint scent of her perfume lingering near the stairwell after she passed. The quiet click of her heels on the old wooden floor when she carried groceries inside. Little details that had always been there, but now seemed sharper, impossible to ignore. One evening, I found myself in the lobby, checking my mailbox. She appeared at the same moment, keys jingling softly in her hand. "Evening," she said with a smile, casual and kind. "Evening?" I echoed, fumbling slightly with the envelopes in my hand. She leaned against the wall as she sorted her own letters, and for a second I caught myself staring. There was something magnetic about the simple way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. She must have felt my eyes on her, because she glanced up suddenly, her gaze locking with mine. It was only a moment, but it felt stretched, suspended like time itself had paused to listen. I looked away first, heat rising in my chest. Later that week, she knocked on my door. "Tea?" she asked, holding 2 cups as though she had already decided I would say yes. I did. Of course I did. We sat at her kitchen table, steam curling upward from the cups. She spoke about little things, the neighborhood, the weather, a book she had just finished. I listened, nodding, but inside I was tuned to something else entirely. The small, unintentional gestures. The way her hand lingered around the rim of the mug. The way she leaned forward when she laughed softly at something I said. At one point, she stood to adjust a crooked frame on the wall above the table. As she reached up, her sleeve brushed lightly against my arm. A faint, fleeting touch, but one that left a warmth spreading beneath my skin. Neither of us acknowledged it, but I knew she felt it too. The pause in her movement, the subtle inhale she tried to mask. When I returned to my apartment that night, I sat in silence, staring at the half-empty cup of tea she had insisted I take with me. Her words from before still echoed in my mind, but now they were joined by something else. The memory of her eyes catching mine, of that fleeting touch, of the silence between us that seemed to say more than either of us dared to voice aloud. The distance between us was still there, polite, respectful, unbroken. But for the first time, I wondered how long it could truly last. It was late when I heard the knock. At first, I thought I had imagined it. The building was usually silent by this hour, save for the hum of pipes and the occasional groan of wood. But then it came again, gentle, measured. I opened the door, and there she stood, my landlady, holding a small container in her hands. "I made too much," she said, almost apologetically, her eyes soft in the hallway light. "Thought you might not have eaten yet." I smiled, a little caught off guard. "That's really kind of you. Thank you." She hesitated, glancing past me into my apartment. "Do you mind if I join you? It feels strange to eat alone sometimes." The way she phrased it made my chest tighten. I stepped aside, and she entered, bringing with her the faint scent of lavender again. Or maybe it was something baked into her very presence, because I seemed to notice it every time she came near. We sat at my small table, the overhead light casting a warm, amber glow over the room. She unpacked the food with a care that made the act feel almost intimate. I realized I hadn't shared a meal with anyone in weeks. At first, the conversation was easy, surface level. She asked about my work, I asked about her day. But as the night stretched on and the food disappeared, something in her tone softened. She told me about her divorce, the silence it left in her evenings, the way people treated her differently afterward, as if she were fragile glass instead of a woman still very much alive. She didn't speak bitterly, only truthfully, her voice carrying that steady confidence, though I caught a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. I admitted my own uncertainties, how I felt unanchored, still searching for my place in the world, always half convinced I didn't belong anywhere. She listened in a way few people did, not just waiting for her turn to speak, but absorbing, considering, as though every word mattered. Her hand rested on the table, fingers lightly curled around her mug. When I stumbled over a sentence, embarrassed by my own honesty, she reached across without hesitation and touched my wrist. It wasn't much, just the brush of her fingers against my skin, but it was enough to still the nervous tremor in my voice. Her touch was cool at first, then warmed quickly, like sunlight slipping through a crack in the blinds. "You don't have to have it all figured out yet," she said softly. "No one really does, no matter how it looks." For a moment, all I could do was look at her, at the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the gentle curve of her lips, the way the candle-like glow of the kitchen light softened every angle of her face. When she finally withdrew her hand, the loss of contact felt sharper than I expected. We stayed like that for a while, two people sitting close, words fading into silence, the night stretching longer than either of us intended. And when she finally rose to leave, thanking me for the company as though I hadn't been the one blessed by hers, the door closed softly behind her, but the warmth of her touch remained, pulsing faintly at my wrist like an echo I couldn't shake. That night, I lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling, knowing something had changed. The whisper, the glances, the touches, they were no longer coincidences. They were a language we had both begun to understand. The morning after our late-night dinner, I expected to see her smile in the hallway, maybe even hear another soft knock on my door. But instead, there was distance. Not spoken, but felt. She passed me on the stairwell, her steps light, her expression polite, as though our laughter and confessions over food had been nothing more than a polite courtesy. She nodded, smiled faintly, and kept walking. I mirrored her restraint, but the shift in her eyes did not escape me. Something had drawn her back into herself. Later that day, I overheard two neighbors talking by the mailboxes. They spoke casually, their voices low but not low enough. My name wasn't mentioned, but the words lingered. She's always been too trusting, especially with young men. Followed by laughter, sharp and dismissive. I walked past them, pretending not to notice, but the words clung to me like damp clothes. I thought of her honesty, the quiet vulnerability she had shown me, and realized how easily people might reduce her to gossip. How quickly the warmth we shared could be twisted into something cheap. That evening I saw her again. She was watering the plants outside her apartment, her movements slow, deliberate. I wanted to speak, to bridge the silence, but something in her posture kept me back. She stood tall, composed, her usual grace intact, but I saw the restraint in her eyes. When I finally approached to hand her the rent slip, I almost wished I could disappear. My hand trembled slightly as I extended the envelope, and in that instant, our fingers brushed. It was the lightest of contacts, barely a touch at all, but it jolted through me like a spark finding dry tinder. Her hand lingered a second too long before she pulled it away, quickly, as if the world might be watching from every window. "Thank you," she said softly, her tone formal, guarded. I nodded, unable to find words. Inside, though, my chest tightened. I wanted to tell her I didn't care what anyone thought, that the moments we shared, the whispers, the late-night laughter, the warmth of her touch, felt more real than anything outside these walls. But instead, I stayed silent, respectful, careful. When I returned to my apartment, the weight of that unspoken truth pressed on me. The walls felt closer, the silence heavier. I could still feel her touch on my skin, faint as it was, yet the memory was sharpened by the ache of what hadn't been said. It struck me then how fragile this was, not just whatever lingered between us, but the courage it required to let it exist at all. She was a woman who had built her dignity piece by piece, and I was a man caught between desire and restraint. And though we hadn't spoken of it, though we kept our words polite and our gestures careful, something undeniable had already begun to form in the spaces between. The storm came suddenly. One moment, the sky was calm, pale blue stretched across the horizon. The next, it was swallowed by dark, rolling clouds. The air thickened, the kind of heavy silence that announces a downpour before the first drop even falls. When the rain finally came, it was relentless, sheets of water hammering against the windows, the wind howling through the cracks of the old building. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went dark, leaving my apartment in an uneasy silence broken only by thunder. A knock came at my door. Quick, firm, but with an urgency that made my pulse quicken. I opened it to find her standing there, a candle in one hand, her expression softened by its flickering glow. "The power's out," she said, her voice almost lost beneath the roar of rain. I thought, it might be better if we waited out together. I nodded quickly, stepping aside. She entered, the faint lavender of her presence mixing with the scent of wet earth drifting in from the storm. The candlelight danced across her features, softening her eyes, drawing shadows along the elegant curve of her face. We settled on the couch, the storm's growl filling the silence we didn't know how to break. She set the candle on the table, its small flame struggling against the dark. Our shoulders nearly touched, the blanket she'd brought draped over both of us. At first, we tried to talk. Small, safe things, whether the storm would pass quickly, stories of past blackouts. But soon, the words thinned, and what remained was the quiet closeness of two people sharing not just a room, but a moment too fragile to name. Lightning cracked outside, the sudden flash illuminating the room, and she flinched just slightly. Without thinking, her hand found my arm. Firm, almost instinctive, the warmth of her palm seeped through my sleeve, and though she tried to withdraw quickly, I covered her hand with mine. She froze, her breath catching. The thunder rolled again, shaking the windows. This time she didn't let go. Her fingers curled lightly around my arm, and I could feel the faint tremor there. Not fear of the storm, but of the closeness we had been circling for weeks. My own heart beat so fast I was sure she could feel it, even through the stillness. The candlelight flickered, casting us in a glow that felt separate from the rest of the world, as if the storm outside had sealed us off into our own private shelter. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Her touch lingered, hesitant but steady, and I let my hand rest over hers, anchoring us both. Time blurred. I don't know if it was minutes or hours, but in that storm, with the world outside thrashing and breaking against itself, what we shared was gentle, quiet, undeniable. When the thunder finally softened, she exhaled slowly, her head leaning just slightly closer to mine. Not a kiss. Not yet. Just the nearness of her breath, the weight of her hand still resting on my arm, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the storm had brought us closer, and neither of us truly wanted to step back again. The storm eased into silence by the early hours of morning. The thunder grew distant, the rain softened into a steady patter against the windows, and for the first time all night, the apartment seemed to breathe again. We sat in the dim candlelight, neither of us rushing to move. The blanket still covered us, our shoulders pressed close, her hand resting where it had settled hours ago against my arm. I could feel the faint rhythm of her pulse through her touch, quick, uneven, betraying emotions she hadn't spoken aloud. She turned her head, and in the flickering glow her eyes found mine. No pretense, no polite smile, just a steady searching gaze that made my breath catch. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy, alive, like the pause between two notes in a song that refuses to end. When she spoke, her voice was softer than the rain outside. "Rent isn't the only thing I want." The words were the same as before, but this time they carried no playfulness, no teasing edge. They were stripped bare, tender, vulnerable, filled with a longing she could no longer mask. My chest tightened. I swallowed, unsure what to say, afraid that anything might break the fragile truth hanging in the air. Instead, I reached for her hand, lifting it gently from my arm. Her skin was warm beneath my fingers, her pulse quickening as I held it between both of mine. She didn't pull away. I brushed my thumb lightly across her knuckles, tracing the small ridges, feeling how delicate and strong she was all at once. She let out a faint breath, one that trembled with both relief and fear, and it was then I realized how much this moment cost her, how much courage it took to let herself want something again. Her other hand lifted, hesitant at first, then with quiet certainty. She brushed a stray lock of hair from my forehead, her fingertips lingering just a second too long against my skin. The touch sent a rush of warmth through me, subtle but overwhelming in its simplicity. Neither of us moved closer. Neither of us crossed that final invisible line. But in that stillness, in the shared breaths and the way our hands held onto each other, something irreversible had happened. We had stopped pretending. The storm outside was nothing more than a soft drizzle now. But inside, the air was charged, alive with every unspoken word. I wanted to tell her how much she had begun to mean to me, how her presence had turned this old building into something like home. But instead, I let the silence speak for me. Her eyes softened, and a faint smile touched her lips. Not wide, not bold, but the kind that held gratitude, recognition, and something tenderer than either of us had dared to name. We sat like that until the candles burned low, our hands still entwined, both of us knowing that whatever line we had crossed tonight wasn't one we would step back from. By the time dawn arrived, the storm had passed completely. The world outside was washed clean, the streets glistening with rain, the air cool and sharp with the scent of wet earth. A soft light filtered through my window, replacing the flickering candle with something steadier, something more real. We had dozed only briefly, if at all. Mostly, we sat in silence, her head resting lightly against the back of the couch, my hand still holding hers as though it had always belonged there. The tension of the night before hadn't dissolved. It had settled, softened, become something less like fire and more like warmth. "Coffee?" I finally asked, my voice quiet, almost reluctant to break the spell. She nodded, and I rose, moving around the small kitchen with a nervous energy I couldn't quite hide. The smell of brewing coffee filled the room, and I poured it into 2 mismatched mugs. When I brought them back, she was already at the table, waiting. The morning light softened everything. The lines of her face, the curve of her smile, the weight she usually carried in her posture. She looked at me as I set the mug down in front of her, and for a moment, I thought she might say something to retreat from the night we'd shared, to tuck it back into a safe corner of unspoken memory. But she didn't. Instead, she reached across the table, her fingers grazing mine before resting there fully. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for the coffee, I knew that. For the silence. For the company. For not running away." I squeezed her hand gently. "You don't need to thank me." Her eyes searched mine, cautious but hopeful. "People talk," she said after a pause. "They always will. And I don't want to be careless with what this is." I nodded, understanding. I'd already heard the whispers, already felt the weight of how others might see us. But sitting there with her hand in mine, the world outside felt small compared to the closeness we shared. "I don't care what they say," I admitted. "I just care about you." Her lips parted, a faint, almost disbelieving smile forming. And then she stood, walking the few steps around the table. I rose to meet her, and without a word, she slipped her arms around my waist. The embrace was slow, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. Her cheek rested lightly against my chest, and I could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against me. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of her settle into me, my arms wrapping around her shoulders in return. It wasn't a kiss, wasn't anything the world might call dramatic. But it was enough, more than enough. In that quiet morning light, with the storm behind us and the whispers of the world outside fading into irrelevance, we chose closeness. Not as a secret, not as something shameful, but as a quiet truth we no longer needed to deny. And as her arms tightened just slightly around me, I realized that this us, this unexpected, impossible, undeniable connection was what I had been waiting for all along. Sparkles, if this story touched you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more slow burn age gap romances, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what moments stayed with you the most.